The car died just as the last strip of daylight disappeared, leaving the highway stretched out like a quiet accusation. I eased onto the shoulder, rain ticking against the windshield, and felt that hollow drop in my stomach, the one that comes when a small problem hints at something larger beneath it. Beside me, Jake, my 16-year-old stepson, lifted his eyes from his phone, reading my face before I could say a word. "It's not starting, is it?" he asked. I shook my head and tried again, the engine coughing once before giving up. The silence that followed felt heavier than the rain. We were miles from home, returning from a family visit my husband Mark had skipped because of work, another skipped thing I'd learned not to question. I called roadside assistance. The wait would be long. Jake leaned back, unbothered, while I stared ahead, cataloguing the familiar tension between what I said out loud and what I kept to myself. Jake and I had an easy truce, respectful, honest, careful. We'd built it slowly over years of shared routines and unspoken boundaries. He trusted me to be steady. I trusted him to tell the truth, even when it was inconvenient. When the tow truck finally arrived, the driver took one look at the engine and shrugged. "Shops are closed. Closest motel's a few miles back. You'll be back on the road in the morning." I texted Mark. "Car broke down. We'll grab a room for the night." His reply came quickly and thin. "Okay." No call. No questions. At the motel desk, the clerk slid a key across the counter and pointed down the hall. 2 beds. 1 night. Practical solutions for practical problems. That's what I told myself as we walked past flickering lights and the faint smell of detergent. Inside the room, Jake dropped his bag and glanced around. "This is fine," he said, like he was reassuring me instead of the other way around. I nodded, forcing a smile, and felt the day settle into my bones. The problem wasn't the car. It wasn't the motel. It was the quiet certainty that something in my marriage had stalled long before tonight, and I'd been coasting, pretending I didn't notice the warning signs. As rain pressed against the window, I understood that this night wasn't an interruption. It was an invitation to stop, to listen, and to face the truth I'd been avoiding. I'd always believed that marriages unraveled loudly, with slammed doors, raised voices, unmistakable proof. Mine didn't. It thinned out quietly, like fog lifting so slowly you don't realize the landscape has changed until it's unrecognizable. Sitting on the edge of the motel bed, listening to the muted hum of traffic outside, I finally admitted how long I'd been ignoring the signs. Mark and I met a decade ago, both cautious, both tired of drama. He was recently widowed, carrying grief like a carefully folded letter he never opened in front of anyone. His son Jake was small then, watchful, already practiced at reading rooms. I didn't step into their lives with grand expectations. I came with patience and the promise to be consistent. Over time, that promise became my identity. Mark and I built something that looked solid from the outside. We paid bills on time, showed up to family events, and mastered the art of smooth small talk. But somewhere along the way, warmth gave way to efficiency. Conversations turned transactional. Who'd pick up groceries, whose turn it was to handle school emails. I told myself this was maturity. Stability. The natural settling of love. Jake noticed the shift before I did. Teenagers always do. He learned when to stay in his room, when to speak, when silence was safer. We shared an unspoken understanding born of living with the same man and interpreting his moods from different angles. I became the steady presence. Mark became the constant absence, even when he was home. That night, Jake sprawled across one bed, flipping through channels with half-hearted interest. "Dad works a lot," he said, not as an excuse, but as a fact he'd already processed. "He does," I replied, hearing the restraint in my own voice. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message from Mark: "Long day. Talk tomorrow." I stared at it, weighing the words. They felt less like reassurance and more like dismissal. As Jake settled in, I turned off the lamp and lay back, eyes open in the dark. I replayed the past few months, the late nights, the guarded phone, the way Mark's attention drifted elsewhere while his body remained beside me. I'd asked once if something was wrong. He'd smiled and told me I worried too much. Lying there, the motel room unfamiliar and temporary, I realized the central conflict wasn't the breakdown of a car. It was the erosion of trust, slow and almost polite, happening in a marriage I was still trying to believe in. And as sleep finally crept in, one thought lingered, insistent and unresolved. When the truth finally surfaced, would I recognize myself on the other side of it? Morning arrived without ceremony, a thin band of light slipping through the curtains and settling across the carpet. For a moment, I forgot where I was. Then the quiet returned, the unfamiliar stillness that had followed us into the motel room, carrying questions I hadn't yet asked out loud. Jake woke first. He stretched, checked his phone, and sat up with the ease of someone who'd learned to adapt quickly. "Any word on the car?" he asked. "Not yet," I said, though I hadn't checked. I was stalling, giving myself time to arrange my thoughts into something manageable. We went downstairs for coffee that tasted burnt and looked like it had given up hours earlier. Jake joked about it, and I smiled at the normalcy of the moment, grateful for his lightness. Yet beneath it, my attention kept drifting back to Mark, to the growing distance that no amount of routine could disguise. While Jake stood by the window, watching cars pull in and out, my phone vibrated. A notification, not a message. I hesitated before opening it, as if instinct already knew what reason refused to accept. A photo filled the screen. Mark, seated at a small cafe table, sunlight warming his face. Across from him sat a woman I didn't recognize, her hand resting on his arm with an ease that suggested familiarity. The caption placed the moment squarely in the present, posted minutes ago. My breath caught. I scrolled, fingers numb. Another photo. Then another. Different days. Same woman. Same closeness. Emily. Jake's voice cut through the fog. What's wrong? I locked the phone, then unlocked it again, as if hoping the images would disappear. They didn't. I think, I said slowly, choosing honesty over protection, your dad hasn't been telling me everything. Jake didn't look surprised. He nodded once, eyes fixed on the window. I kind of figured, he said. He's been elsewhere. The simplicity of his response hurt more than the evidence itself. It meant this wasn't new. It meant I'd been the last to know. Mark called minutes later. I answered, my voice steady despite the storm beneath it. Who is she? I asked. There was a pause, long enough to confirm everything. I didn't want it to come out like this, he finally said. That was all. No denial. No explanation that mattered. I ended the call and looked at Jake. In his silence, I saw a mix of resignation and relief, like someone tired of carrying a truth alone. The motel lobby hummed around us, ordinary and indifferent, while my understanding shifted into something sharper. This night away from home hadn't created the fracture, it had exposed it. And as we returned to the room to wait for the tow, I knew the hardest part wasn't discovering the betrayal. It was accepting that the life I'd been holding together was already changing, whether I was ready or not. The drive home felt longer than the miles suggested. The car ran smoothly again, almost mockingly so, as if nothing had ever gone wrong. Jake stared out the window, headphones on, giving me space I didn't ask for but deeply appreciated. I used the quiet to rehearse conversations I wasn't sure I'd have the courage to finish. When we pulled into the driveway, Mark was already there. His posture, hands in pockets, shoulders squared, looked practiced, like he'd been preparing for this moment instead of dreading it. Jake slipped past us with a brief nod and disappeared into his room, leaving the air between Mark and me charged and unfinished. I can explain, Mark began. I didn't invite him inside. I leaned against the car, grounding myself in the cool metal. You already did, I said. When you paused. When you chose convenience over honesty. He tried to soften his expression, to summon the version of himself that once convinced me stability was love. It didn't mean anything, he said, the words falling into a pattern I recognized from 1,000 stories that weren't mine. It means everything, I replied. Because it didn't start yesterday. He looked away. That was answer enough. Inside, the house felt smaller, the walls crowded with memories that no longer agreed on their meaning. I moved through the rooms, noticing details I'd once ignored, the spare quiet of Mark's office, the careful way his phone rested face down on the table, the practiced normalcy of a life designed to avoid questions. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table. Mark spoke about stress, about feeling unseen, about mistakes. I listened, not to be persuaded, but to understand how long I'd been negotiating against my own instincts. When he finished, there was a pause, wide and telling. "I'm not making decisions tonight," I said. "But I won't pretend anymore." He nodded, subdued, as if relief had replaced remorse. That, too, was information. Later, I checked on Jake. He met my eyes, searching for cues. "You okay?" he asked. "I will be," I said, meaning it. "And so will you." He accepted that, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, and returned to his homework. In his quiet resilience, I found resolve. That night, as I lay awake in my own bed, the truth settled without drama. The betrayal didn't end my marriage, it clarified it. Tomorrow would bring logistics and conversations and consequences. But tonight offered something rarer, a clean understanding of what I could no longer carry. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, it felt honest that I end the days that followed. Time seemed to stretch and compress in unpredictable ways. Conversations with Mark became deliberate and measured, stripped of the easy shorthand we once relied on. We spoke about logistics first, schedules, finances, the practical scaffolding of a shared life, because those topics were safer than emotions. But beneath every sentence lay the central truth we were circling. Trust, once fractured, doesn't mend itself through explanation. Jake watched us with a quiet attentiveness that reminded me how much children learn by observation. I made a point to be steady, to keep routines intact where I could. Consistency, I'd learned, is a language he understands. One evening, as we cleared the table together, he said, "I'm glad you're not pretending." The simplicity of it caught me off guard. "Me too," I said. And I meant it, not as a verdict on the future, but as a commitment to the present. Mark asked for time. He asked for patience. I listened without promising either. What I offered instead was honesty. "I need clarity," I told him. "Not assurances. Not stories. Clarity." That night, alone in the living room, I revisited the moments I'd minimized, the late nights framed as ambition, the distance disguised as fatigue, the way my questions had been answered with reassurance instead of truth. None of it was explosive. All of it mattered. I realized then that the central conflict wasn't simply infidelity. It was the tension between who I'd been accommodating, hopeful, quiet, and who I was becoming. Someone willing to name what hurt. Someone unwilling to trade certainty for comfort. As the house settled into sleep, I wrote a short list in my notebook. Not demands. Boundaries. What I needed to move forward, whatever that meant. The act itself felt grounding, like placing markers on a map before choosing a route. I closed the notebook and turned off the light, aware that resolution doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in decisions made daily, sometimes hourly. The road ahead was still unwritten, but it was no longer obscured by denial. Tomorrow would require courage. Tonight, it was enough to recognize that stopping, really stopping, had allowed me to see where I stood. And with that clarity came the quiet resolve to keep going, even if the destination had changed. A week passed, then another, and the house learned a new rhythm, careful, quieter, attentive. Mark tried to fill the space with effort, early dinners, open conversations, small gestures that arrived a little too late. I acknowledged them without mistaking activity for repair. The central conflict remained unchanged, sitting between us like an unanswered question that shaped every interaction. One evening, Mark asked if we could talk, really talk. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, the distance deliberate. He spoke about fear, about not wanting to disrupt the life we'd built, about how secrecy had felt easier than confrontation. I listened, noticing how often his explanations centered on avoidance rather than accountability. "I need to know why," I said. "Not the circumstances, the choice." He hesitated. "Because I didn't think I'd lose you." The honesty, imperfect as it was, landed. It clarified something essential. The betrayal wasn't born of passion but of complacency. That knowledge didn't absolve him, it reframed the risk I faced if nothing changed. Later, Jake knocked on my door. He sat on the edge of the bed, careful with his words. "Whatever happens," he said, "I don't want things to be weird between us." They won't be, I replied. That's not on you. In that moment, I understood my responsibility more clearly than ever. Choices made by adults ripple outward. My steadiness could be a counterweight to uncertainty, a reminder that honesty is a form of care. I took a day off work and walked alone through a nearby park, leaves beginning to turn. I considered what forgiveness would require, not from Mark, but from myself. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't a finish line. It was a process contingent on change, transparency, and time. That night, I told Mark what I needed next: counseling, full disclosure, patience without pressure. He agreed, relief and apprehension crossing his face. Agreement wasn't progress, but it was a start. As I went to bed, the house quiet again, I felt a cautious steadiness take hold. The story wasn't resolved, it was being rewritten sentence by sentence. And for the first time since the car stalled on that rain-dark highway, I sensed movement not away from the truth, but toward it. Counseling began on a Tuesday evening, the kind of appointment you circle on the calendar and then dread as it approaches. Mark arrived early, I noticed because he rarely did anymore. The waiting room smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant, neutral and impersonal, an odd place to bring something as fragile as a marriage. The therapist asked us to describe why we were there. Mark spoke first, careful and composed. He used words like mistake and disconnect. When it was my turn, I chose different language. I talked about erosion. About how love doesn't usually vanish, it thins, grain by grain, until you can see through it. Mark listened, truly listened, in a way I hadn't felt in years. That didn't heal anything, but it mattered. At home, Jake adjusted to the changes with quiet competence. He noticed the calendar notes, the way conversations paused when he entered a room. One night, while we folded laundry, he said, "I'm glad you're doing something about it." "About what?" I asked. "About not pretending," he said, matching socks with precision. "It makes things easier." His words stayed with me. Pretending had been my default for too long, pretending stability was intimacy, pretending silence was peace. Naming the problem didn't fix it, but it stripped away the fog. Mark and I set boundaries that felt both obvious and difficult: transparency with phones, shared schedules, honest answers even when they were uncomfortable. Some days, this brought us closer. Other days, it highlighted how far apart we were. Progress, I learned, isn't linear, it's revealing. One evening, after a long session, Mark admitted something small but telling. "I didn't realize how lonely you were," he said. I met his gaze. "I told you," I replied gently. "You just didn't hear me." The admission landed between us, heavy and instructive. Loneliness isn't cured by proximity, it requires attention, effort, choice. Later that night, I stood by the window and watched the streetlights flicker on. I thought about the stalled car, the motel room, the way clarity had arrived uninvited. I didn't know where our story would end. I knew only that continuing without honesty was no longer an option. As I turned away from the glass, a steady resolve settled in. The next chapter wouldn't be easy, but it would be real. And for now, that was enough to keep going. Weeks passed, and the house felt different, lighter in some ways, heavier in others. The tension hadn't disappeared, it had shifted, settling into corners where silence had once reigned. Mark was present in ways I hadn't noticed before: a hand on my back while I cooked, a text checking in mid-afternoon, a pause in conversation to make sure I had a voice in decisions. Effort, at last, had a shape. Jake adapted, quietly, as he always did. His perceptiveness became a subtle anchor. One evening, while we sat in the living room finishing homework and grading papers, he said casually, "I can tell things are different now." "Different good or different bad?" I asked, curious despite myself. "Different honest," he said, without hesitation. The simplicity of his observation stunned me. Sometimes children see the truth more clearly than adults, stripping away excuses we cling to and calling attention to what matters most. I smiled at him, not needing to explain. At night, Mark and I continued to navigate uncharted territory. The betrayal lingered like a shadow, but acknowledgement had shifted its weight. We discussed feelings, not just facts. I learned that accountability is not a single act, it's repeated, deliberate, and uncomfortable. Mark's attempts at openness weren't always perfect, but they were consistent. And in their consistency, I found a thread of trust one hadn't realized I could reclaim. One evening, after dinner, I caught him staring at me from across the kitchen. "I don't want to lose this," he said softly. I paused, feeling the weight of everything, the mistakes, the silence, the small victories. "We can't erase the past," I said, "but we can try to see it clearly, together." He nodded, eyes lowered, and in that quiet exchange, a fragile understanding formed. No fireworks, no grand declarations. Just recognition that relationships are rebuilt not with words alone, but with intentional, daily choices. Later, as I tucked Jake into bed, he whispered, "Thanks for being honest with me." The words struck a chord I hadn't expected. Honesty, rare, deliberate, often difficult, was reshaping all of us. It wasn't the end of pain, but it was the beginning of clarity. Afterward, I sat by the window and watched the neighborhood lights blink on, one by one. The stillness was not empty, it was reflective, a quiet reminder that life continues whether we are ready or not. The car that had stalled on that rainy highway seemed like a distant memory, yet it had been the catalyst I didn't know I needed, a pause that forced me to confront truths I'd long avoided. For the first time in months, I felt grounded, aware that the road ahead would be difficult but navigable. I understood that reconciliation, if it came, would not erase the past, it would honor it, learning from it while moving forward. And with that awareness, I allowed myself a deep, steady breath, ready for whatever came next.